and welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. And this episode, we're going to be taking a step back from politics. South Asia seems honestly surprisingly stable and democratic compared to the rest of the world at the moment, and move on to an economic topic that a lot of India watchers have been curious about. You see, globally, industrial policy seems to be back in fashion after a 4-decade-long hiatus since the Reagan-Thatcher reforms. Countries are taking a lot more of a strategic approach to what they produce and where the supply chain source from. And the focus of many of these industrial policies in the years post the pandemic have been on semiconductors. Now, India isn't far behind in this trend, and its latest push into semiconductors is interesting and merits some investigation. So that's why we brought on our first guest, who's going to help us break down the goals, policies, progress, and ambitions behind India's semiconductor moonshot. Stay tuned. Today, we're joined by Pranay Kotestani, the Deputy Director of the Takshashila Institution and the Chair of the High-Tech Geopolitics Program. Pranay has co-authored a number of books, including Missing in Action, Why Should You Care About Public Policy, and When the Chips Are Down, a deep dive into a global crisis. Before joining Takshashila, Pranay has worked with Fortune 500 companies on integrated circuit design for mobile processors. So he's the perfect guest to have on for this podcast to maybe help break down the different aspects of India's semiconductor push. So Pranay, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks, Tushar. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. To begin with, we've seen a substantial increase in both the interest and discourse on the semiconductor and chip industry, particularly since the pandemic. We keep on hearing about these companies like NVIDIA shooting up in valuation. Could you maybe, to start with, outline the role that semiconductors and chips play in our modern economy? What explains the sharp increase in demand for chips and the rising valuations of chip designers like NVIDIA? And why is India looking to enter this sector?
Right. So, Tushar, there's a very famous quote which goes by the line that we never know the worth of water till the well is dry. So, it's a quote by Thomas Fuller, and that pretty much applies to semiconductors as well. So, before, it's not as if semiconductors were started being used after 2019. Semiconductors have been used since 1950s, 60s very actively. But just the fact that multiple things happened during this period made the world realize how metacritical semiconductors are. So until this time, the supply chain worked so perfectly that we never even bothered about thinking of this humble chip which runs every device of ours, right? The laptop that we are on, the mobile phones that we speak, all of them do have ICs, integrated circuits and chips in them. Right? But the supply chain worked so well that when we spoke tech, we only spoke of the things that run on top of those chips, and that is the software. So tech was synonymous with software for all these years. And then in 2019 and 2020, 3 different strands come together, and that made the world realize why semiconductors are metacritical. And these 3 strands are geopolitical, geoeconomic, and technological. So I'll explain all these 3. One is geopolitical. So first of all, the worsening US-China relationship had a big role to play. One, because we know that Taiwan is a major manufacturer of semiconductor chips, and the fact that China-Taiwan relations were worsening made the world take notice that what happens in the eventuality that China takes over Taiwan. You know, what happens to the chips that are being used, made in TSMC and are being used by the US military even, right? So what happens in that eventuality was a big concern. The second geopolitical thing was that the tech war between US and China heightened, right? So the President Trump's administration first imposed sanctions on Huawei and ZTE, and that was the starting of export control regime on chips, right? Because if you want to impose some sanctions on another country, it's very difficult to do that on software. You can do something related to hardware, and that is in China's tech stack. This is one weakness, right? It is done reasonably well in software, but not so much in chips. So a basic rule of strategy is you attack your adversary where your adversary is the weakest. So that's why the US imposed sanctions on semiconductors. So that was the first trend. But even though this was just starting, the pandemic hit. And in the pandemic, there were a whole lot of things happened. Primarily the fact that first, the demand of chips dipped because automotives, no one wanted to run cars and step outside during the COVID-19 pandemic. But when the COVID-19 pandemic started going away and automotives companies again started demanding these chips to be manufactured, they discovered that they didn't have slots from these contract manufacturers who produce chips, because these slots were already taken by the laptop manufacturers, the mobile manufacturers, the data center manufacturers, because we were all on Zoom, right, during the entire pandemic. So the demand for all that rose up, and there's only limited capacity for manufacturing chips. You can't suddenly create a fab out of thin air, even if you want to. So this made the world realize that this supply chain is incredibly efficient, but it is not so resilient. And we need to think of the geo-economic consequences of this, not just geopolitical. What if there's a drought in Taiwan? What if there's an earthquake in Japan? What will happen to the entire world, right? So that was the second strand, which was geo-economic. And the third one is technological. So just the fact that you have artificial intelligence, machine learning, and large language models, which were gaining steam at that point of time, and the idea that to do new things in, let's say, autonomous vehicles, or to do 5G, 6G, for all these things, the base layer is always semiconductors. You will need new architectures, new designs, new chips which are required. So these three were the important strands that sort of came together in the 2019 to 2021 period, and that made the entire world outside the semiconductor industry notice that, hey, this supply chain is important for us. So let's do something about it to ensure that it becomes resilient in one way or the other, and it is not in the hands of an adversary which can block your access to it. So that's why you saw the world taking notice of it, and the stock prices also rising, and that's where we are.
Right, and that's interesting because I suspect the same argument could be applied to many sectors, especially for India. We import a substantial amount of things we need, like for defense requirements, etc. But for some reason, in the chip industry in particular, for all its strategic and commercial importance, it still remains very concentrated. You have these large companies that dominate certain levels of the supply chain. I'm just wondering, to make our listeners understand why this might be the case, could you give them an overview of the chip manufacturing or the semiconductor manufacturing process? What does the production process look like? Who are the major players in its global value chain? And what are the sort of technical or economic constraints that, raise barriers of entry to enter this industry? Why is it so difficult for different companies to start producing chips?
Let's take a step back and think of your iPhone, right? So imagine there is an iPhone, and for the iPhone, there will be a core processor chip, which is called a system on chip, which will be the brains behind that iPhone, right? It controls all the functions. So let's say you want a particular capability that your iPhone should be able to have wonderful photos. Now, in order to take wonderful pics, you will need to be able to design a chip which takes into care that functionality, which is optimized for the speed, optimized for the performance, the light conditions, etc. Right? So someone has to go and design that kind of chip with the right kind of components, the right kind of memory, the right kind of sensors, and all that has to be put together on the chip. Right? So it's literally like building a city inside a very small space. Right? So the current numbers are that you will have around 135 million transistors in per millimeter square of that IC. Right? So it's mind-boggling number, right? So, and those transistors are etched and carved out on silicon through very specific instruments. Now, you can imagine you're building something at that minute scale, and just like when you build a city, you are going to build buildings. You're also going to have roads, which are actually in this context the interconnects which carry the power. And they route it through this entire chip. So all those things cannot be done by hand, right? It's impossible to do it. So what happens is the first stage of this will be something called the chip design process. So there will be a group of engineers who will come together and they'll say, so we need this kind of functionality, this kind of latency for your taking a photo. So what are the components required in this chip? What kind of memory is required? What kind of sensor is required? So all that is thought of as a design. The blueprint is thought of. And as you can imagine, this is a human capital intensive process. You require a lot of engineers. You need very specific tools, software, which are used to place these transistors, to connect all of them. You need specific intellectual property. Let's say you need a specific processor for this. So all those things are brought together, integrated in this engineering process, which can take around a year in companies to literally come up with the next generation of a processor, right? So this is the first stage, which is called design. Broadly speaking, today it accounts for nearly 33% of the value addition. And this is not a concentrated industry at all. So NVIDIA's name is popular today just because AI is an important thing, and in its GPUs are really, really fundamental. And its GPUs are popular not just because it does that kind of chips, but also because it does something called a software library called CUDA, which is on top of that. So it built an entire ecosystem for people to use GPUs, and that's why it has the lead. But there are many other companies in this. There's AMD, NVIDIA, there is a bunch of startups, because all you need to be in this stage is you need a group of smart engineers, and you can get started with a few licenses of these software tools which are used to place this design, and you can make a product. Okay, so there's not much entry barriers. So this supply chain has a lot of players in it, a lot of countries also involved in it. 20% of this design sector labor is in India. Almost all top 25 of the design firms in the world have their design center in Bangalore, right? So India is a very important player in this segment. This is the first segment broadly. So once you have the blueprint decided, you know how exactly to put those 135 million transistor on a per millimeter square area and how they are connected. You design all that. That blueprint is passed over to a firm which does the actual manufacturing. So you have a silicon wafer and you literally etch all those transistors out and you connect them to make your circuit function the way you want it. Now again, imagine this is the capital intensive part, right? Because you need to do that at a precision which is really immaculate. You can't even go wrong by few microns, right? Few microns means your chip doesn't work at all. So you need that kind of precision. So you need machines which are really, really specific. So there's something called photolithography, which is one of the processes of chip design, where a company like ASML comes in. It's a Dutch company, and every machine of it costs around $200 million, right? That's one machine, a pop wall. That's the extreme ultraviolet lithography machine, which is used to carve out really, really minute transistors, which are used in the most advanced chips. So these kinds of things require huge amount of capital first to get those machines, and then to have extremely pure environments where you don't, even a speck of dust can ruin your chip, right? So you need clean rooms, you need ultra pure water, you need an environment in which there is absolutely no contamination. You need specific gases, because there are a bunch of steps you need to do to realize this chip in practice. So this is obviously a capital intensive step, and its value addition has increased over the years. Earlier it was a contracted job, right? So since the 80s, the way the industry has evolved is that first, this step also used to be done by the company which used to do the design. But then people realize the costs of doing this are increasing so high that it's not possible for every company to have their own fabrication unit. So some people in East Asia came up with this idea that you don't need to start your own fab. We will do it for you. So we will be the contract manufacturers, contract fab, and you just do the design and give the blueprint to us. We'll manufacture it for you, whether you're AMD, whether you're NVIDIA, doesn't matter, but we'll give you the chips. So this sort of made this sector consolidate, right? So as a design firm, I didn't need to build my fab. I can just get a bunch of engineers together and produce a blueprint and send it over to a contract manufacturer, right? So this was a economic innovation which was fundamental to the development of this sector. So this sector got concentrated in countries which were willing to put in this kind of money. Second, at that point of time, it was also environmentally polluting in the 80s and 90s. So the US and EU didn't want to get into this at all. So in East Asia, there were countries which were willing to say that we'll bear this cost and we will try to build this industry up, right? So that's why a lot of things started getting built up in Taiwan, South Korea, earlier in Japan, but mostly in South Korea, Taiwan, to a smaller extent in Singapore and Malaysia. So this was the fabrication sector. So capital intensive. With the latest TSMC fab in Arizona cost $12 billion, right? So that's the entry barrier. If you have $12 billion to sell out, you can start one. Otherwise, you're out of the game. So that was the second one. The third, once you have the chips sort of laid out, the transistors laid out on the chip, the third step is you cut out those chips from the silicon wafer. It literally looks like a waffle, and a circular waffle with those squares, and each square is a chip or can be multiple chips. So you need to cut that waffle and you need to package that chips which can be used in your phones. So that step is called assembly, test, and packaging. So generally that's when you do all these things, and this is again a labor intensive process to a certain extent, because you need some people to do the assembly and steps. So you do require instruments, but not of the kind that you require for the fabrication stage. So this is because this is labor intensive, some capital required, it is not that concentrated. So it is, if you see, there are multiple players like in Malaysia, Singapore, there is something happening in Taiwan, obviously, China. So a lot of countries are involved in it, a lot of companies, and most of the time you would not have even heard of that company, just like we hadn't heard of TSMC 4-5 years ago. So in this sector, the value addition totally is roughly about 12 to 13% of the value chain. So this is sort of how the entire global value chain is spread. Some of these are really, really tough to get into. The entry barriers are high. In others, the entry barrier might not be money, but it might be better business conditions. It might be an engineering talent. So those are the kinds of entry barriers which might come into being. So this is how the steps go. You design it, you then fabricate it, and then you assemble it. All of these are today mostly done by different companies. So it is truly a global cooperation effort and that has literally made the Moore's law thrive. So Moore's law wouldn't have survived. Moore's law is the idea that the density of transistors sort of doubles every 18 months in a IC, but that was just sort of a prediction, it was a vision. And that,
right, which would be computing power, right? I mean, the W transistors correspond to
the number of transistors which correspond to the more processing power, more kinds of things you can do in the same workload. So that sort of was it was kept up by a technological innovation which made the transistors go smaller and smaller. But the other side was also an economic revolution, which was this. So fabrication, fabulous companies, the design companies were freed from making $12 billion of investments because they could just contract it out to manufacturers. The manufacturers in turn could farm out the assembly and packaging to other countries where this could be done at a cheaper rate. So this kept the industry going for all these years. And there are estimates that any chip sort of goes around 4 times across the world in order to be manufactured fine.
So that's interesting because at different levels of the supply chain, it has different levels of concentration. It seems like a highly specialized at different stages, a very technically demanding, a very capital intensive endeavor, with very exacting standards. How does India, or rather at which stage does India intend to break into this sector, given its fairly lackluster manufacturing performance historically? What do you think are India's competitive strengths vis-a-vis major global players? And how will you evaluate the progress of its semiconductor push so far?
Unlike many other countries, India has a strong presence in the overall semiconductor global value chain, right? So if Indian designers were to stop working in semiconductors for one reason or the other, the industry would literally stop, So because its significant presence exists
At the design stage, that is.
at the design stage, right? So that is very important. So India has presence in this since 1985 with various foreign firms establishing their design centers. So that's the first stage. Obviously, manufacturing, as you rightly said, is not a comparative strength of India's in especially advanced manufacturing. So there have been multiple attempts, but they haven't been successful, and we can talk about those later. But what India's attempt has been is to develop an ecosystem which goes not just in design, but also develops a presence in fabrication and assembly and get that entire ecosystem going. Now, the things which are different now is first, uh, earlier you didn't have the downstream industry there, right? So you didn't have the Apple's manufacturing within India. These are the PCBs and the phones, etc. Right? So now you already have an ecosystem which is a demand for chips made in India. So that is one new thing. India is able to do electronics manufacturing. Once a company has the confidence that there are electronics manufacturers here, the next step you go to is chip assembly. So once you are able to do chip assembly, then you want to do the chip manufacturing, right? So that's how you climb up the value chain. And that's what we are seeing happen in India. Already there is Apple, which started on the electronics manufacturing through Foxconn and its other contract manufacturers. And after that, you also saw Micron, which is a very well-known memory maker. It makes memory chips, and those are the assembly plant for that is going to be set up in India. So if once Micron comes in, it will be a big signal to India, to the world, that India can do manufacturing of chips as well. So that's what we are seeing already. There are 4 assembly plants which are going to start, and 1 chip fabrication unit which is going to start. So none of India's previous attempts, there have been 4 attempts in the past, had gotten to this stage, right? So we are going to start seeing the Micron assembly plant rolling out its first chips probably by the end of the next year. So that is already much farther than India had gone before, right? So that's already happening. And I think broadly, India understands that this is not a short-term game. Taiwan also took 30, 40 years to get to where it is. So it's a long game. The minister has said this repeatedly, that it is a 20-year game, and a 20-year game is very different from 21-year games, right? So you need to think hard about the long-term strategy. You need to make capital investments, big bets, because every fab in the world has had some government support or some government help. So now Indian government is also offering that, and the aim is not to start at the most cutting edge. So India is not chasing TSMCs of the world, which make the world's most advanced chips. The idea is to start slow, start at 28 nanometers, which is a good all-rounder node of sorts. Those kinds of chips are used for automotives, they are used sometimes in phones, they are used for a number of appliances. So that's where the fab is going to come up. And the hope is that once it starts going, it will learn, and over time you will start doing the more cutting-edge work as time passes.
Right. And just as an addition to that, you said there are 4 semiconductor fabrication units. They've been set up in India. I believe there's Gujarat, the one in Noida.
No, those are not fabs. So
okay.
Fabs or manufacturing units or foundries are somewhat same. That's the manufacturing bit where the blueprint is converted into transistors and their connections on a wafer. That part is one. So one company, Tata and a Taiwanese company called PSMC, which is the fifth largest chip maker in the world, they have collaborated to start in Dholera, which is in Gujarat. And the other four, which we have seen news of, are all assembly plants.
Right. And I think that brings us to my next question, no doubt, because this is not India's first foray into semiconductor production. I think we had a push for a public sector interest or a company in the 1980s called SCL. And then there was also another one in 2006-7, where I think Intel was interested in manufacturing in India, and that didn't happen. We also heard about the recent Vedanta Foxconn project, which fell through. So there have been setbacks. Maybe could you outline why did the previous attempts fail? And what are the sort of challenges and hurdles that this attempt will need to overcome to be successful?
Right. So in our book, When the Chips Are Down, we try to classify these attempts into some meaningful categories. And we came up with sort of three versions of Indian semiconductor policy. So version one was by the government and for the government. That's what we name it. The reason being, this was the pre-liberalization era, where India thought of semiconductors pretty much as a government-run enterprise, which government companies will do. Something similar to what USSR tried and what China tried back then as well. All three attempts failed. Okay, so all of them had similar characteristics. Government companies start with some enthusiasm. They have a good kind of a good core of engineers who are able to get some prototypes out initially, and they think that they have it there. Right? So that's what happened in USSR, in China, and even in India too. In fact, before the SCL, there was Bharat Electronics Limited, which was a company started in the 1950s, and that also started trying to manufacture chips later on. But all of them had initial prototypes, things started working, but soon they hit this problem, which we discussed, that capital costs of manufacturing kept rising as you wanted to make the transistor smaller and smaller. So that's called the flip of Moore's law. It's called the Rock's law, where the capital cost of making the next advanced chip, next advanced node keeps doubling every 4 years. So that's what all these companies started hitting, that you needed to do capital infusion every 4 years, because you need to have double the amount of money if you want to do the next advanced node, right? So how will a government company do this after every 4 years? Very difficult to justify for a country which was also dealing with other developmental challenges, right? So that was the step where the government thought that, these companies can't do this kind of capital intensive work. So let them do the less advanced work and let them produce these chips only for a small amount. And that went to the government agencies like space and for limited defense purposes. So these companies, instead of trying to push for doing capital investment and then produce in a large numbers for a commercial base like television sets, etc., they stepped back and they started doing these things only for government agencies, right? Because you don't need that much capital for doing the less advanced chips, and space you will need a few hundred chips, not a few million chips. So that was the first step. Second, because these were government run, the government also thought that there shouldn't be competition between these companies, because the money is coming from the same hand, which is the government's hand. So it's told BEL to stop manufacturing chips and let SCL manufacture chips. So there was no competition, no incentive for the companies to innovate and do something new as well. That was the second reason. And third reason was no foreign exchange. So a lot of these products you need to import and you need to make. So you needed to have a machine which will do photolithography. Now for that you need foreign exchange, and foreign exchange was limited. So companies often face this restriction that they couldn't get in the manufacturing tools on time. So by the time they got a manufacturing done, it was so outdated that their customers rather chose to import the chips than depend on this. So this was the first stage. That's why this process failed. The second version was attempted roughly from 2006-7 to 2014-15, the same period. And that is the era which we call the unease of doing business era, because there were a lot of attempts, but they were not backed by good doing business conditions. As you can imagine, if you want to put $12 billion or $6 billion of upfront investment, and the first chips from this will only come 5-6 years down the line, you need to have a heart of steel to be able to make that investment and trust the policy environment, the tax environment, the trade environment of that country in which you are investing in, right? Because you are dependent on, for 5 years, you are going to invest money without getting a penny back from this investment. So you need a business environment which permits or good investor confidence. And that was not the case in India during that period. Even you also had the Vodafone case famously in 2011-12, that further down the confidence that investors had, because there was retrospective taxation laws which came into being. Trade, we were also having import duties, because again, if you want to do assembly, you need to import the wafers, you need to import the machines, you need liberal import policies. That was also not so forthcoming. So all these things made it very difficult for any investor to show the courage to invest in India. And they could just do that in China, where the environment was more permitting. That was why the second attempt also failed. Second version of the attempts failed. And the third version is now, where after the pandemic or during the pandemic, the government realized that it has to get into this game for the metacritical 3 reasons that I mentioned above. And the change in the policies is, one, the government is giving upfront capital support. The government is not saying that we will subsidize money for you, that you start producing and then we'll give you some money after you start producing. So it's not a production-linked incentive, which you've been studying, right? So it's not, unlike a production-linked incentive, these are upfront capital support. So government is saying that as you start even constructing the plant, we will give you support and we'll back every rupee that you give with a rupee from the government side. This is the union government promise. So this sort of increases some confidence that the government is really in this game for good now. It is not going to back off. So that's one thing which has changed. The second one itself is, as I said, the downstream demand has increased. The world knows that India can do electronics manufacturing. So there's that confidence as well. And generally, you have better infrastructure in India as well. So that also helps when you want to minimize costs. So all these things are coming together. The final point, which is in India's favor, is the geopolitics as well, right? So US-India relations are good. India's pitch is also that it wants to do this collaboratively with the world. So all that sort of helps push India's case like never before.
Right. And I think it's interesting that you talked about the 80s and the way, certain import restrictions, for instance, maybe hobbled the industry to some extent, because I feel the semiconductor moonshot is part of a much wider array of, industrial policy initiatives seen since 2014. Call it the Make in India initiative, and there have been different starts and stops to that, but that's part of any industrial policy in any country. The question I have is about one of the core concepts, which is Atmanirbharta, which translates roughly to self-reliance. And just that word in this context, it does raise some concerns about, maybe a return to the autarky or the import substitution-esque policies that we saw before 1991. How does India's post-2014 policy differ from its previous approaches to industrial policy? How does that concept reconcile with India's ambitions to become sort of a semiconductor manufacturing hub?
So I have written extensively criticizing some aspects of Atmanirbharta. So first, I think as a slogan, it is great because it shows that India wants to do something. There's a confidence that we can make things. So as a narrative, it is really good. But specific policies which are used for Atmanirbharta can be counterproductive. So for example, our import tariffs have been increasing over the last 5-6 years because the attempt in many sectors is that we will localize and globalize simultaneously, right? So idea is we want to also prevent foreign companies from coming in, and also we want to become a part of the global manufacturing value chain. So obviously these things can't happen simultaneously, and previous experience says that you need to China, Vietnam, all of them first tried to globalize and then tried to localize. And there's a great paper by the think tank ICRIER on this idea of first globalizing and then localizing. So that's been the angle that I have been talking about with respect to Atmanirbhar Bharat policy. So, but on the semiconductor area specifically, I think the government is much more sensible. It realizes that India can't become self-reliant in this sector for the next 30, 40 years. In fact, no country in the world is self-reliant, not even the US, not even Taiwan. Taiwan's biggest export is chips, but its biggest imports are also ICs because it needs things to make ICs, right? So it needs machines, it needs a whole lot of other electronics to make it. So no country in the world is Atmanirbhar in that sense in this sector. And India also realizes that it is not going to be Atmanirbhar entirely. So the game here is really about becoming a core part of this value chain, a partner that the world can trust. And that's the pitch that everyone from the PM to the ministers have been talking about, that it's not about autarky in semiconductors, it is literally cooperation. Right? So I always say that in semiconductors, plurilateral cooperation is a necessity and not a choice. You can't become a completely self-reliant partner. So that's why the pitch has always been that can there be more GCCs, Global Capability Centers in India, right? So it's not about an Indian company only. It's also about can the Qualcomms and NVIDIAs and Broadcoms of the world do more of their design work in India? Can we certify our engineers better or train them better such that they are part of the value chain across the world? Can there be partnerships across the world for doing this, right? So for example, India is talking about semiconductors with US on the ISET partnership. There's a understanding between Japan and India. There is also the India-EU Trade and Technology Council where semiconductors are a big action item, right? So on all these things, the idea is collaborate with multiple partners so that India can become a partner that they can trust for doing more things on semiconductors. So the pitch is not about being autarkic in semiconductors. It is about being a reliable partner.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pranay. And for our listeners, Pranay has recently released a book that deals extensively with the subject. Pranay, you want to shout this out once more and tell them where our global listeners can find your book?
Sure. The book is called When the Chips Are Down. It's published by Bloomsbury, and it takes into account the entire development of the semiconductor sector from a public policy angle. What were the public policy aspects that made semiconductor ecosystem flourish in some countries and not in others? And it has a chapter on India as well, which deals extensively with India's experience.
Fantastic. So very interesting industry to keep an eye out for, especially with developing capabilities in AI and requirements for them. And let's see how successfully India can break into this. So yeah, Pranay, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks, Tushar.
That was Pranay Kotestani, the Deputy Director of the Takshashila Institution, probably one of the best qualified people to speak on this issue. But India's semiconductor push isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a global geopolitical drive that has countries like the United States and China trying to set up their own domestic chip manufacturing base. Because semiconductors aren't just another trade good, but rather a strategic and economic tool that might be as important to the geopolitics of the 21st century as oil was to the 20th. Our next guest is going to help us explore the wider macroeconomic aspects of this global race for semiconductor dominance. What role can India play in this competition? And what challenges will it have to overcome to become the next semiconductor superpower? Stay tuned. Today we're joined by Trinh Nguyen. Trinh is a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's a senior economist covering emerging Asia at Natixis, based in Hong Kong since 2015. Prior to that, Trinh worked at HSBC as an ASEAN economist as well as a consultant at the World Bank. So Trinh, we're really glad to have you on Beyond the Indus. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Fantastic. So Trinh, just to begin with, we're sort of witnessing a resurgence in industrial policy around the world. You have your Made in China 2025, the CHIPS Act in the United States, to Make in India back in India. So With many of these focusing on semiconductors, could you maybe explain the strategic and economic shifts driving these trends and how they're reflected in the global chip industry? How might India stand to gain or lose from these trends?
First of all, semiconductor is an intermediate. What that means is that you actually don't see it in every A, right? It's embedded in rice cookers, it's embedded in cars, it's embedded in your phones, it's embedded in everyday electric appliances, in the frontier technology, in 5G, in AI, and so on and so forth. It's an intermediate goods that's very valuable. In fact, it's the most valuable item in terms of global value of trade, right? It's value about 1.1 trillion. Obviously, that has a lot of double accounting because, what's exported out of Malaysia is because it's packaging chips. A lot of it's accounted for the inputs that they have imported, right? Meaning global sales is roughly about 527 billion in 2023. So it's a very important item. It's an important item for commercial purposes. It's an important item if you want to develop manufacturing, if you consume manufactured goods, and if you have an ambition to raise your value add, right? So a good example is that Vietnam has a lot of global market share in electronics, but it actually just assemble. It doesn't have the production of intermediates. The intermediates it has to import from somewhere else, right? To make an Samsung Electronics Mobile imports the chips from South Korea, for example. And I think it's important because it's an area where the U.S. excel. It has about 50% of global value chain. And about 24% of it is on the fabrication, and the other one is competitive research, and the other end is basically what we call back-end operations, which is assembling. So the U.S. has a lot of the design of it, but it doesn't have the fabrication of it, where a lot of it is taking place in East Asia, particularly on the higher end, primarily in Taiwan and South Korea. What that means is that during COVID, when we had a global supply shock, and even before COVID, during the Trump administration, China published China Made in 2025 that wants to become self-sufficient in chips, right? This is the one key manufacturer item that China has a big deficit in, and it wants to narrow that. It wants to move up the value chain, right? It's successful in making chips at a lower end, but it wants to move up in a higher end chips. And this has created what we call the trade war, which turned into investment war, into sanctions in chips, and as a result has disrupted a global investment cycle. And the U.S. isn't just throwing out sanctions. It, as you mentioned, it's throwing a lot of support for its own sector, right? It has the CHIPS Act that throws out subsidies. And it isn't the only country. China has subsidized already roughly 150 billion on that, and recently announced another 47 billion. So it throws a lot of money to become self-sufficient. And the EU as well. The EU also realized during COVID that it needs to manufacture more chips, not just for commercial reasons, but also for security reasons. And so has Japan with 25 billion. South Korea with 19 billion, and South Korea wants to create a mega cluster worth 472 billion in the next 20 years. And here comes India, right? India wants to within Make in India, India wants to focus on ICT. And within the ICT sector, it had created something called the production linked incentives, and semiconductor is an important part of that, right? So it allocates roughly 10 billion over a longer horizon, and every year within the budget, it allocates a certain amount to this sector. And now I think that's quite important for India for several reasons, because as it wants to grow in ICT, which is assembling of the phone, it wants to be able to add value add, right? So it looks at countries like Vietnam and say, well, we want to focus on high tech. We want to assemble, but we don't just want to be an assembling plant. We want to be able to actually over time add value, and also for security reasons, it also wants to do so. It wants to do so at a lower end of the chips, and it puts a lot of focus onto it. The latest budget, if you look at the allocation, the PLI, this sector got quite a lot. So in other words, I think it's a sector that everyone anticipate not only to be the most valuable, but also to be more valuable in the future. And there's a lot of money thrown at it globally to raise capacity, and India is part of that race.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned the value addition part of this, because that's essentially what happened in East Asia. You had your basic putting together stuff, basic manufacturing, and because of government support and guidance, you saw the incubation of advanced manufacturing industries. And I feel like East Asia is the gold standard of industrial policy. Could you maybe outline the success factors that led to countries like Taiwan and South Korea establishing successful chip manufacturing ecosystems? And how do India's policies stack up against these?
Right. There are two schools of thoughts, right? One is laissez-faire, let's let the market allocate capital efficiently. And there's another school of thought, which says the government has to step in and intervene to allow for much more efficient allocation of very limited capital and resources to then develop sectors, particularly when you don't have the knowledge know-how, the technological know-how. And through that, through an export-led model, you then grow out of poverty, essentially. And now East Asia took that government-led, government developmental model much more aggressively than other countries, and have had success in being able to do that. How does it do that? It does that by having first a desire to do it, right? A vision, the governmental vision to do it, to then attract, usually for Taiwan, for example, in 1974, it decided, because of its own economic crisis, it decided that, and of course being kicked out of the UN and so on and so forth, decided that it wants to develop the semiconductor sector and convince RCA, which is Radio Corporation America, to transfer the technology to Taiwan. Now, it didn't do that haphazardly, right? It does it by creating an R&D research institute to support it, and it didn't just research and development on just whatever, but they're actually very commercial products, which then goes on to support indigenous companies, right? Which later spun off as UMC, which is still in operation today. And eventually when TSMC came in the 1980s, it also got significant support. How did they do it? They did it by having strategic planning, coordination with the private sector, as I mentioned, coordination by attracting RCA initially to then share the technology, providing concentration of very limited national resource to these sectors, to these companies via financing, via R&D support, via incentives, via for infrastructure, not just in logistics, but education, because in this sector, it's very skilled. You really need your university and education to be there for a private sector firm. And regarding the inputs, not just land, labor, also loan, and so on and so forth. And as a result, these companies have grown. I think the second thing that's very different about Taiwan is that it exposed the Taiwanese firms to foreign competition by attracting them to have them come and produce in Taiwan, and they'll get incentives if they meet a certain export limit. So they never were banned or protect from competition. In fact, UMC floundered because of complacency, because it was getting more support, whereas TSMC rose to be dominating in the manufacturing, right? And I think the reason I would say the story in Taiwan is very similar to resonate with what's happening in South Korea, what's happening later on in China, is that you have a very aggressive concentration of state policy support over a long horizon. So as a result, it's able to enter these sectors that have very high moats, right? This is a sector that you need a lot of capital. You need also a lot of inputs, like, for example, it's very electricity intensive. It needs a lot of capital, and it's at the frontier of technological know-how, right? But it doesn't mean that there isn't a way to enter, as it enter not through the design, but through the fabrication of it, and many others have taken similar paths. An example one would say is Malaysia. Malaysia is doing the packaging aspect of it. The question is that because Malaysia, because of its political instability in the past several decades, haven't been able to do more than just the back end manufacturing of chips, but it in itself has created significant linkages, and I think it builds a good foundation to do more. So what lessons can India learn from this? I think India certainly realized that, and due to its own historical experience with this, right? It's not the first time it wants to build chips or ICT and so on and so forth. It understands that it also needs to help domestic firms. It needs domestic firms to get help through partnering with foreign partners that have the technological know-how. It needs help from the government through subsidies. It needs help, which is the creation of the PLI, right? But it also needs to do, and then tax breaks. But it also needs to do more than that. I think it needs to do what Taiwan did, which is, allowing for support via loans, via land, via input costs. And I think what you look at what the infrastructure boom during the Modi decade, and I think the one thing he's done really well is to really focus on energy, right? It understands that to grow, not just semiconductor, but any sector in manufacturing, it needs, it's very industrialization is very energy intensive. And I think it's done well in the first phase of emphasis on the CapEx cycle to look at energy and broadening out energy beyond its traditional reliance on fossil fuel of coal and oil to now having a lot of renewable. But I would say that we need long-term. So the fact that Modi is recently reelected, he has another 5 years, and hopefully that he's able to then speed up this process, and irrespective of who replaces it, and beyond that, we'll also have the longer-term vision. And to summarize this is that which means that at some level in India, institutional support needs to be there that is continuous beyond the different generations. And one of the positives I saw in the budget was that the fact that this sector itself got more allocation, but also the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology got a huge increase in allocation, right? Which goes to show that the government is very serious about it.
Right, and it's still a big debate in India because I think a lot of Indians have bad memories of the pre-1991 license Raj as the example of how a government might interfere in an economy. But, I did part of my undergraduate in Hong Kong, and I saw firsthand how countries like China, can take their economies from third world to the first in a single generation because of government support. And in all fairness, India's Make in India and PLI schemes have seen some success in boosting India's manufacturing exports, particularly in electronics and smartphones. To what extent do you think it will be able to replicate this success in its foray into semiconductors?
I think they're doing this concurrently. I don't think that the ICT and the semiconductors are part of one plan, right? It wants, and India is a big country. When I say that, it means that it has a lot of people, which means these people need jobs. The labor market is huge. The ICT sector doesn't employ that many people. IT itself is only 5 million. So therefore, you want to then add more employment in terms of assembling, right? But you don't want to just give them assembly. You want to be able to add value. So the semiconductor strategy is part of that. So how, to what extent will it be successful? I think we're just at the nascent stage of it, right? And I think it will be successful. It's able to create clusters. When you obviously you saw the partnership that's happening in some of the three major projects. But generally speaking, I think we need more support. I think a lot of the local companies need partners. They need much more support than they're being given at the moment. I think capital, the government itself is included in the JP Morgan index as help ease the cost of capital for the Indian government, which hopefully then ease liquidity to have access. But you can't just really allow market forces to really do this as well. I do think that the government needs to do more to support. I think there is a lot of hurdle to still manufacture in India. You can see that within the ICT sector in terms of manufacturing, it has been able to grow its market share. But India global market share is still very small, so it's growing from a small base. So I do think that because it's coming from a small base and it puts a lot of effort into it, it will succeed. It's a question of how you want to benchmark your success, right? If you grow a lot from a small base, then of course, it's not really there. But actually, India wants to have 20% global market share, so it does have great ambition in this sector. Now, to do that, I think that it will need to be much more aggressive. What I've mentioned, what Taiwan had done, means that giving a larger share in the budget isn't necessary enough, right? It has to pull all the weights behind it. And when you look at India's budget allocation, the PLI itself got roughly 1.5 million, and about 800 something million of it goes to the electronic sector, which primarily a lot of that support goes to the semiconductor sector. But most of the budget goes to the agriculture sector, right, where the voter base is. So it's being still captive by its requirement to really answer to the populace. So I think it's going to be an interesting sector to watch for India. And the second aspect of this regarding semiconductor is also other pulls that India will need to make, right? So this sector is a strategic sector. It's important for national security. It's important to move up the value chain. But its ability to impact the large size of labor that India needs is also quite limited. So I think that when you think it's very similar to allocation of the budget, you get more bang for your bucks to allocate a lot to the rural sector, but that in itself is not going to move the needle in terms of productivity, right? Because it's the least productive sector in India. Meaning I think they're moving in the right direction, but I think it would be still not where it's needed to reach the ambition of 20% global market share. And I think that in the future, more would be needed.
Yeah, and I suppose a broader question is, and one that's confused Indian policymakers and economists for several years, is India really should have a larger manufacturing sector. On paper, India should have a much larger low-end manufacturing sector than it has right now. And historically, India's always been manufacturing lightweight compared to economies like China, Malaysia, and Vietnam on a similar, or at least theoretically similar, development level. You've spent some time analyzing the challenges and limitations that hold back Indian manufacturing. Could you outline what those are and how they might impact India's chip manufacturing ambitions?
I think there are two challenges to India that is what we call long-standing reforms that's necessary. One, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned on what happened in Taiwan, one of the reasons Taiwan was able to gain market share relative to the US in terms of manufacturing semiconductor is that it sees the limitations in doing so in the US, right? Which is a lot of regulations and burden. And one of the things they did is they unburdened that, right? And allowed the skills and so on, the labor, unburdening the inputs to production, regulations and so on and so forth, and making it smooth sailing. Now, I think in India, the subsidies are in the right direction. The support for CapEx is the right direction. But labor is still very protective, right? What that means is that India traditionally is a market where it tries to protect what's already there, rather than a market where it has policies to transform the economy, if that makes sense. A good example is the labor market reforms. Traditionally, before Modi's reform of removing this barrier of 100 people in a factory, if you have more than that, if you employ more than that, you have to then involve the government if you want to fire them, right? And I think that's very bureaucratic, and that introduces a lot of red tape. and they raised that ceiling to 300. But even that in itself means that there's a reason why a lot of employment in India is informal. It's because there's a lot of red tape that makes people want to avoid the formal system, right? The second aspect is the ability to acquire land, large pieces of land. And one of the legacies of that is the fact that to protect farmers, which then one of the legacies of that is that the land existing land policy is to really protect farmers. So the government doesn't have eminent domain to be able to come over and take over land that's necessary, right, for large-scale industrial developments. Now, one of the ways to do that, of course, is to create industrial parks, but the government itself would have to have lots of land to build these industrial parks to overcome the existing infrastructure. So there is a lot of gridlock to this. And the second aspect also, I would say, is capital, access to capital, right? So beyond the inputs of land, labor, capital. I think there could be more support from the Indian government for the sectors that they target. And I think one of the reasons, if you look at the growth of India in recent years, it's primarily driven by government capex, whereas private sector capex has been rather weak. So Indian firms find it very difficult to operate in the existing bureaucratic environment in India, and removing this red tape is quite important. So as a result, even though we're making substantial progress in India, if you look at the FDI inflows into India, whether it's low or high, first of all, it underperforms portfolio investment, which is investors buying stocks and bonds. FDI generally means more greenfield, which means you build a factory or you do M&A. And that significantly underperforms. So what's interesting about India FDI is a lot of it is into services, the sector that doesn't have to deal with a lot of these issues that I just mentioned. The second one is manufacturing. Even though manufacturing FDI has increased, it's still very, very small. If you look at the numbers, the absolute numbers, they even it's very tiny, sub $10 billion US, right? So I do think that there is room to grow that substantially. And it's to do so, I think that it would need to emphasize it much more. What I mean to say by that is that if you analyze India's budget very carefully, you'll see that, of course, the allocations to these sectors are going from zero to hero, right? So every year they're a bit more. The PLI never existed before. It was 800 million fiscal year before, and now it's 1.5. Within that, we have a huge emphasis on ICT, so that's great. It's getting roughly 800. So that's a huge increase in percentage and in emphasis. However, I do think that if you compare that again to other items and to the magnitude that's needed, particularly of what other countries are throwing at it, then I do think that India needs to refocus more on the sector in terms of government resources. And perhaps maybe if the budget itself is quite difficult to divvy up as is undergoing fiscal consolidation, and it's difficult to remove support to the farmers who's basically the voter bank, then perhaps India can start thinking about other reforms, which I think is also quite difficult as well because it's very politically challenging. But if Modi in his third term can't do it, I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone else to do so, right? So I think there's definitely a window of opportunity here for Modi to really target some of these frictions to production in India, to really allow it to be more lubricated. But certainly the direction is going the right way, in that it's already working on physical infrastructure, which traditionally has been a roadblock. And I think now we need to work on the soft infrastructure side of things. Of course, continue with the physical infrastructure, continue focusing on expanding the energy source to lower the input costs, to continue to focus on the education sector, right? If it wants to develop semiconductor, what's very clear is it has to have top-notch education at the frontier of technology, right? So continue support in education to match what is demanded of the sector, for example. And of course, other areas I just mentioned, such as land and labor reforms. And I think that's a key area where China, I would say, was able to do much easier. But obviously, the state owns all the land, right? As a preface to start. So in this case, we're working in a democracy, so it's a little bit different and much more complicated. And I think that's one of the challenges that India has had. The second thing is that it's the scale, right? So a country like Vietnam, it's much smaller, and again, it's very similar to China. Is that it can move in areas it wants very quickly, because of the political system. And I would say that it doesn't mean that India can't do it. It just means that it needs a lot of political will, a lot of consensus. I am not sure that there is a consensus within India, even though there's a campaign, there's an increased allocation, that there is a consensus that this is the direction we need to steer the ship. And therefore, we need to then harness all the national resources, right? To use all of the resources to then support the sector, right? So if you look at back in Taiwan, what they did was not only they did all the support I mentioned, but also they made sure that all the large companies also support through the funding of these nascent company and sectors that they want. And obviously, because a lot of these companies weren't committed, they sold very quickly, which now if you think about it, they've lost out on being able to have equity in these companies that are now very successful. But the bottom line is that the whole state, the whole apparatus was very focused in moving the ship in one direction. And I do think that for India, the whole apparatus needs to be focused on moving the ship towards the manufactured dream, the make in India manufactured dream. And then that means that when you see the allocation of the budget, the policies being created, they have to move in a much bolder direction, right? And I think for now, it remains too small, this sector, in terms of not just semiconductor actually gets, even if it's small, it's actually taking the largest chunk, the government is actually quite serious about it. I am talking about manufacturing in general, right? It's still too small because beyond this sector that's getting a lot of emphasis by the government, other sectors are not manufacturing, so especially labor intensive and so on and so forth, is not getting as much support. So I do think that on an aggregate, I would like to see much, much, much stronger support from India to push this industrialization goal it has going for it. And I think geopolitically, very similar to Taiwan during the time, why did RCA, a U.S. company, give this technology, transfer the technology to Taiwan? Well, one, they didn't see it as a threat, right? TSMC create this fabulous concept in which basically the American companies can unburden themselves by focusing on designing and then offshoring the fabrication of the chips to a company like TSMC, right? Why do they trust that? Because geopolitically, Taiwan is not a threat, right, for the U.S. The same with India. India has a geopolitical tailwind, and it doesn't mean that it's getting not just portfolio flows. But I also think countries, like-minded countries, do want India to rise. For India to be able to do this, this is if you see the collaboration between Tata and Taiwan, that's an example, right? And I think if you look at the U.S. CHIPS Act, within it, they have collaboration in terms of education and sharing technology. And I think India itself can further facilitate that, right? To then attract a lot of investment within India, and get collaboration. And the fact is that geopolitics is very important. And when you want to acquire foreign technology, you do need support of those countries. But also importantly, you need to support your own industries and move limited national resource to where you want to develop, right?
Right. And I think aside from the government support and domestic consensus politically, as well as maybe favorable geopolitical factors that we're seeing, with the shifting supply chains and friendshoring, et cetera, you have these large established private companies that have international supply chains. And India is going to require a substantial amount of foreign investment and technology from these players to establish a successful chip design and manufacturing ecosystem, but advanced manufacturing in general. What steps do you think it would have to take to establish itself as an attractive destination for chip and other kinds of manufacturing? And on the other end of it, what sort of opportunities do you see in the short to medium term for global players looking to invest in chip and other manufacturing sectors and adjacent sectors as well in India right now?
I would say that so one is attracting investments from foreign investors, and two, to then at the same time build your own technological company, right? So those two and two need to go together, right? If you don't have both, then you're gonna have a situation where the only thing you have to offer is cheap input costs, right? And I think this is not what the Indian government wants to do. What would make it successful? If you have big flagship projects, it would make it successful. And then other investors would see that as a sign of success. I'll give you an example, is that when Vietnam attracted Intel investment in the early 2000s, many people said that this is not the place to invest. Vietnam doesn't have the skill, doesn't have the infrastructure. Everything's really messy, right? And actually, in fact, that's exactly what happened. They couldn't find the skilled workers. It's very messy. They had to send all these workers to other East Asian countries to get trained and so on and so forth. But the success of that particular investment, in which they saw, and the government did everything it could to solve those problems, paved ways for big ticket projects. So in my opinion, and this is why it's very important for India to get big ticket projects, in terms of attracting it. And of course, not just attracting foreign projects, but also have an emphasis to support local firms to tap into that supply chain. And usually, when you have these big ticket projects, the smaller firms will follow, right? Because they see that as a sign that it's a country that they can do business. So I think these several projects that are expected to come into play in 2026 and so on and so forth are very important to watch. And it's very important for the government to make sure those projects are successful. And if there are complications, they should address them to be able to move on and use them as, in a way, paving the ways of more to come. What do I think? So those are the key thing that I think India needs to do. In that, when you're a country trying to move into a new sector, a new frontier, it's bound to have challenges, and doing business in India or any emerging market is challenging. But I think that if India has the ambition to succeed, it should make sure that the hurdles for the projects they prioritize are removed, right? And then I think that in itself will be the beginning of more successes to come.
Right. And that's great, because so many economists, give really general sort of recommendations about, improve governance standards or, improve so-and-so well-being. But it's these specific steps, like attracting big ticket projects, that I think raise the comfort levels of, other smaller companies within the supply chain. And that's how you set up that trend. But you're right, a lot of challenges ahead for India, some limited success. And I'm sure you and I both will be keeping an eye out for how India is going to progress on these issues. So yeah, Trin, thanks so much for your insights, and thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all for this episode of Beyond the Indus. We don't normally cover economic issues, so I found this episode particularly fascinating. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, or ideas for topics that we can cover, you can email them to us at beyondtheindus@gmail.com. We'll be back next month, so until then, stay safe, take care, and bye.